Please welcome Bill Schuette.
Well, they spelled it right. This is going to be a good day. I like that. Good afternoon, Michigan Republicans. How are you? Come on. How are you? All right. Well, listen, thank you. It's great to be here. All the Schuettes, my wife and I, daughter Heidi, son Bill, appreciate so much the support and kindness of everybody here at Mackinac and across the state. So thanks for being here. In a few moments, I'm going to introduce a guy named Daniel Cameron, who is the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Now, Daniel Cameron is a smart guy and is the first Republican Attorney General in the state of Kentucky since almost the beginning of time, about 70 years, and he's the first independently elected statewide African American in Kentucky history. So it is he's a great guy, highly credentialed, and he's been able to accumulate the support across the Republican spectrum, across the Republican universe in the state of Kentucky, which is no easy feat. But what I want to do is add a little context to about attorneys general and why they're important and what attorneys general should do. And then you'll hear from Daniel. Now, I had the privilege of serving as Michigan's Attorney General for 8 years. And part of my job as Attorney General is to defend the Constitution, because attorneys general are on the front line of protecting the Constitution and on the final line of defense to defend the Constitution. And I did that as your Attorney General, and defending our law in the state of Michigan that required equal treatment in admission to our outstanding colleges and universities. No preferences, simply equal treatment. And that case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court in a case called Schuette versus Bam, by any means necessary. And it was actually pretty fun coaching and teaching justices of the United States Supreme Court how to pronounce Schuette. And I just said, Your Honor, just say on duty Bill Schuette 3 times and you'll get it down pat. Now, they were pretty quick studies, and they learned that, and they were able to say Schuette. And that case will go up in the law books, on the record books, because we won that case. I defended the Constitution. I did my job. That's what attorneys general should do, defend the Constitution, ladies and gentlemen. Right. And that's what Daniel Cameron does in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And also, when I served as your Attorney General, I was the chairman of a group called the Republican Attorneys General Association, which composes all the Republicans who are attorneys general at the time. And there were 32 attorneys general that I helped position and land and elect across this nation, and which is 32 is kind of way more than half of 50 states in our country. And in that job, we would seemingly sue the Obama administration daily because of the overreach and the unconstitutional Obama's penchant for writing with his pen instead of trying to work through Congress to pass rules and regulations. And we fought that on a daily basis. And that's when I first came to learn about this guy, a rising star in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And what Daniel Cameron does now is lead and drive the Republican Attorneys General Association. And here's an example. What he does is fight the reckless efforts to defund the police, which would cause crime to go up and threatens and imperils public safety in states across the United States of America. Daniel Cameron understands that defunding the police is wrong because he supports local cops and wants to have safe streets in cities across the state of Kentucky and the United States of America. And that's what attorneys general should do. And speaking of overreach, and how do you, what's another word for the Biden administration? I'd call it massive failure. In the most recent efforts by the Biden administration to acquire and mandate that private businesses require vaccines, it's wrong. It's wrong, and it needs to be stopped. We need to stop the erosion of civil liberties. But what Daniel Cameron is doing is organizing Republican attorneys general across the nation to fight the overreach of these Biden mandates on vaccines. And what leadership should be is trying to solve problems. And when President Biden issues those vaccine mandates, all it does is cause more unrest and more controversy. It's not healing. It's not solving a problem. But in Daniel Cameron, you have a mature, thoughtful, aggressive, smart Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And all I have to say is we in Michigan need to have an Attorney General in our state to do what Daniel Cameron does in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I don't know if we have any candidates for Attorney General here in this room. Are there any candidates for Attorney General in this room? We need a new Attorney General in the state of Michigan, ladies and gentlemen. That's our job. So, let me just introduce a great guy, smart fellow, marvelous wife that we just got to meet, my wife Cynthia and I. And ladies and gentlemen, give up a big Michigan, Mackinac, Grand Hotel welcome for Daniel Cameron, the Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. All right. All right, pal. Nice to meet you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much, General Schuette, for that kind introduction. And hello, ladies and gentlemen. How's everybody doing? Good, good. It's certainly an honor to be with you, Mackinac Island, and I'll just be honest with you. My reason for being here is twofold. I obviously wanted to be here to take part in this very storied conference. In fact, Pete Bisbee, who is the executive director of the Republican Attorneys General Association, some of you all may know him, impressed upon me the importance of coming to this retreat and how awesome it is, and it certainly has not disappointed. We've had a wonderful time, but I will tell you there was another reason to come. This island holds some sentimental value for my wife and I, Mackenzie. It is where we honeymooned a little more than a year ago. So thank you, I must say thank you to the Michigan GOP for allowing me to get a few brownie points with Mackenzie. So thank you all so much. Now I'm getting ready to sit down, as most of you all know, and sit down with a distinguished group to talk about criminal justice issues, but I did want to take just a few moments to talk about my day job as an Attorney General. I serve in Kentucky, as General Schuette noted, and like many attorneys general, perhaps not all, I understand that might not be the case here, we've had to, in this country, think about the intersection of our federal and state constitutions with COVID-19. And let me just stress, and I've said this from the beginning of the pandemic, that whether you were President Trump or now President Biden or our governors or our local officials or our mayors, whomever, we all understand the responsibility to keep folks safe. And you and I know that instinctively. We don't necessarily need government to tell us how to be more cautious and more courteous. Most of us in this room have lived by that old principle from the Bible. That is to be a good neighbor and to love your neighbor as yourself. But I want all of you to know that there are a group of Republican attorneys general across this country that recognize that it is an equally important responsibility and task to make sure that we're standing up for the constitutional rights of all of our citizens in the United States of America. And let me just say that for our Constitution to endure, it must be defended at all times, regardless of how convenient or complicated. In 1788, James Madison spoke to a convention of Virginia delegates gathered together to ratify the Constitution. and he said this: "I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations." Madison's words are just as relevant today as they were in 1788. Whether in times of conflict and crisis or peace and prosperity, we can never take our constitutional rights for granted, especially when some of the decisions that are being made in governors' mansions across this country are devoid of common sense. And I think some of you that reside here in Michigan can sympathize by what I mean when I say that. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that in my own home state. In Kentucky, in the early days of the pandemic, our governor decided to put an unconstitutional restriction on travel. Under the governor's order, if you lived in northern Kentucky and you wanted to go across the river to Ohio because you liked Montgomery Inn barbecue, you couldn't make that 20-minute trip over the bridge into Cincinnati without having to come back into our home state and quarantine. But you could drive from northern Kentucky to West Kentucky, a 4 or 5 hour drive, depending on where you live, without having to do anything. Now, I'm all for trading in state, and we've got some pretty good barbecue down in West Kentucky. But if the concern was the risk of increased COVID exposure, then how, I'll ask you, is a 4 or 5 hour drive, in which presumably you would stop along the way, less risky than a 20-minute trip? That didn't make sense to most folks, and it was an unconstitutional restriction on travel. So we went into federal court, the court struck it down, and the governor ultimately rescinded that order. Our governor also decided, as in many states around the country, to shut down in-person worship services in the name of COVID. Again, this was a decision that most folks thought was devoid of common sense, because on a Sunday morning, you could drive by a church parking lot and see that it was completely empty. Meanwhile, you could go past a Lowe's or a Home Depot and see that it was those parking lots were completely full of vehicles. Again, that struck most of us, I think, sitting in this room and across this country, as being devoid of common sense. Because in one hand, you had churches that are protected by the First Amendment, but they were told they had to close down. Meanwhile, in the other hand, you had those stores that I talked about that didn't have to close. Again, devoid of common sense, and it was unconstitutional per our First Amendment rights in this country. So we went into federal court, and after a series of decisions, ultimately got in-person worship services started again in Kentucky. Now look, I don't tell these stories to toot the horn of our office. In fact, at one point, we made the decision to challenge the entire scope of the governor's ability to issue emergency orders in this context, in this pandemic. We went all the way to the state Supreme Court and ultimately lost that case 7-0. Now, I'm not proud of that fact, and I vigorously disagreed with our state Supreme Court's decision. But what I think it did ultimately is helped our legislature come back into session earlier this year and make changes to how the decision-making process works as it relates to our governor being able to consult with and needing to consult with our General Assembly, because they represent and reflect the values of the will of the people in all of our 120 counties. And as a legal matter, I think it showed that our office and Republican attorneys general across this country had the courage of our convictions to do what is right by our citizens and our Constitution without fear or favor. And again, what I've shared with you is representative not only of our office, but the work of Republican AGs to stand up for the rule of law. You know, recently I was asked, what is exactly meant by the rule of law? I know that that term can sound, or phrase can sound distant and vague, but I assure you, when I make that comment, what was meant is that no one is above the law, and that the laws of this country should apply equally and fairly to every citizen without fear or favor. We shouldn't be moved by the changing winds of social media, pop culture, and our corporations. Our priorities should be moored to the Constitution and to the timeless values that have anchored our communities for over 200 years: faith, family, and freedom. That's what And as General Schuette knows, that's what Republican AGs have been trying to do, is to defend those timeless values. The working men and women of this country need to know that when the current administration cancels the Keystone Pipeline, we're going to be there so that when they're trying to promote a climate agenda that works for the few at the expense of the many, we're going to stand up for them. And families sitting at the dinner table discussing their budgets should know that when a Treasury Secretary in Washington tries to mandate what a state can and cannot do concerning their own tax policies, we're going to stand up for them. And church parishioners should know that when a government tries to shut down houses of worship in the name of public health while allowing liquor stores to stay open, we are going to stand up for them. These, as attorneys general across this country, should be our first principles. Now, I've talked to a few of you over the course of the last couple of days, and I know you're troubled by the president's vaccine mandate. The president says that it's constitutional, even though a few months ago his administration said he didn't have the authority to do it. If that new OSHA rule goes into effect, the executive branch of our federal government will be inserting itself into the employment prerogatives of businesses all over this country. This move strikes many of us that are in this room across the country as unconstitutional because it removes the ability for a state to make such a decision. Those decisions have traditionally been within the authority of a state because of their sovereignty, and gives the power instead to the federal government. Ultimately, the courts will have to make this determination, and I assure you that Republican attorneys general will be a part of that conversation. We will be a part of that conversation because we understand that we represent your values and that we defend your constitutional rights. I appreciate you giving me a few minutes to talk briefly about the subject of what attorneys general do. I hope that in the coming years ahead, that my office, that Republican Attorney General's office across the country will have the ability to rely on Michigan to help us in this fight. God bless you, and thank you so much.
Please welcome Keith Den Hollander.
Wow, those lights are bright. Good afternoon. What a great conference. Isn't it great to be back here together on Mackinac Island again? For too many years, we've had too many issues that have been Democrat or Republican issues. Criminal justice issues have been one of those issues. That's one of the reasons that the Christian Coalition helped to pull together this panel discussion today. In recent years, we've seen radical policies put forward by the left where they impose reforms on our police and prosecutors. Today, we're going to hear how Republicans are showing incredible leadership in making common sense improvements with our law enforcement and prosecutors. To lead us in that discussion, please join me in welcoming our moderator, Micah Derry, who will introduce our distinguished panel. Well, hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that everyone had a wonderful lunch. I know that for a few of us here on the panel, we were just across the street and had some of the fantastic product out of Lake Michigan. I have to say, I'm a fan, and I do say that genuinely, hailing from the state of Ohio. Believe me, I can compliment Lake Michigan all day long, so thank you so much for having us. I'm so excited to have this panel with us today. And the group of men and women that is here really distinguishes themselves when it comes to being leaders. And as we get the opportunity to ask questions to each of these members, we'll share a little bit of what they bring uniquely to this conversation. But really, there's one important thing to remember, and that is that our Constitution, as you just heard the Attorney General saying, is an inspired document. And whenever we find ourselves as a country operating outside of the principles of that founding document, there will be symptoms of that failure. And we see many of those symptoms today when we just turn on the news. And so we're going to begin, though, by recognizing some of the incredible work that's happened at the federal and state level as Republicans have taken the lead on certain key criminal justice reforms. And so we are so privileged today to be able to start with Congressman Doug Collins, hailing from Georgia, who was the champion on the First Step Act that President Trump was able to sign into law, really breaking a logjam that had lasted years. And so we're going to begin with asking the congressman, there had been this logjam. There had been a breakdown in those over partisan issues, and an unwillingness to work together. How on earth was it a Republican with a Republican president that was able to step up and to be able to move it and explain a little bit what the First Step Act was and why it was so monumental?
Well, I do that, and it's good to be here and good to be in Michigan, and for the Ohio-Michigan connection, all I have to say is go Dogs. Some of you get that on the way home. It'll be okay. You're going to be bouncing across the water. You'll figure it out. But no, it was really something that it was a time, and I think this is what we find so many times in a legislative body. A legislative body, you look for proper timing, and we were able to look at it from a perspective, from a Republican conservative perspective. No one was going to question, is Doug Collins a conservative because he talked about criminal justice. My father's a state trooper, 31 years. I've lived in the law enforcement community. I've grown up in this, but also as a pastor, as a chaplain with an Air Force who's went across the world and deployed. This was something that I said for the first time, let's as conservatives. If you're in this room today as a conservative, there's two things that I want to point out. The First Step Act, as opposed to some things that have been said about it, was not a get out of jail free card. It was basically saying, let's look at what we do. As conservatives, and I served on the state level, served on the federal level, and one of the things we found, and I said, how do we make this simple? Because Attorney General, you just get a great speech, but you kept it simple. And then people can follow that. And when you, in Congress, as we know, you've got to keep it even more simple for Congress people. Okay, we need it really simple. And so I broke it down into two things, and I call it M&Ms. I enjoyed M&Ms, it made it good anyway. And for conservatives, if you're in this room today and you're not sure about criminal justice reform, if you're not sure about taking prison reform and getting people out, then I got a couple of things for you. Number one is this: 95% of anybody who is put in jail from federal to state to local level will come home at some point. 95%. It's not that they go away and never come back, they do come home. What do you do with them when they get back? And then from a conservative perspective, you have what they call the M&Ms, monies and morals. Conservatives, we are the party that believes in people. We're the party that can look at somebody in the eye and say, we believe in you and want to give you the opportunity and the chance, and that's the part we have to start with. But too many in our party say, well, what about money? I got a perfect answer for you. You start reforming your criminal justice system, you start seeing people back to work, you start seeing your prison populations go down, and you start seeing communities put back together, which in the long run saves money in your budgets and your processes. We were able to come along and say, this is what we want to do in the federal system because we'd seen it work on the state level. So we started saying, how can we take prisoners who want to choose to go through a process of working on their mental health, working on their education, working on their skills so they can come back out and have a job. And I had a great partner at the time, Hakeem Jeffries, who was a Democrat lead on this, and we began to work it. But at the end of the day, it was about explaining to people, this was not about, and I think I've heard this term, and I'm sort of, frankly, I'll be a little bit tired of it. It's not hug a thug. If you're a believer, or even not a believer in this room, and you believe in people as a conservative, then everybody that you just attached a thug to is somebody's son, daughter, person. And they're all made in God's image. There's not anybody you're going to meet today that's not made in God's image. And when we understand that, that's how you take criminal justice reform. And then I have to say the last part of that, of getting that done, was the White House. Jared Kushner and Donald Trump. Both of them said, and the President Trump said, he was skeptical at the time. And I remember sitting in his office, and if you've ever been around him, it's this big person, oh, I don't know if we can do that. I said, well, Mr. President, we can. And then Jared worked on it. And then he finally, when he connected the dots, he believed in people too, and that's how he got it done.
No, absolutely. I mean, and I think that what is particularly outstanding about that is, for a lot of people, didn't understand what a champion you were until you fought like mad hell to get that done, which was outstanding. And unfortunately, Congressman is not with us in representing the fine district of Georgia any longer. But when we lose a champion in Congress, new champions have to rise up. And that's why I think we're particularly privileged to have Congresswoman Nancy Mace representing the 1st District of South Carolina with us. You know, Representative, as you come into the halls of Congress and for all the dysfunction that is there, you know, I understand that you've actually picked up an issue that Congressman Collins was working on, really protecting constitutional rights of someone who is already in the system. So tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now with privileged communication.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for being here today. It's a true honor. You know, dysfunction would be an understatement, I guess, of the century. But before I answer the question, I do want to praise Doug Collins for his leadership on the First Step Act. I was a state lawmaker. It was huge. I mean, civil rights, criminal justice reform, these have always been Republican issues, but the last couple of decades, we really haven't taken it. We haven't had very much leadership. But when that bill was signed into law in December of 2018, I was a state lawmaker. I was a freshman state lawmaker in South Carolina before I came to Congress. But the one and only bill that I had signed into law, and I did it last year in the middle of COVID, was modeled after the First Step Act, and I did it in South Carolina. One of the provisions in the First Step Act was that they prohibited women from being restrained in prison who were giving birth. Can you imagine giving birth as a woman and then tying you to your bed? I don't think a woman in prison is going to be trying to flee while she's giving birth. And so in that bill, and I worked with Democrats on it, but we allowed women in the state system to get feminine hygiene products, but also we incentivized women to maybe get out of jail, get out of the state penitentiary system, and by allowing them to have their kids come and visit them once a week. I can think of no better opportunity to give someone a second chance by allowing them to see their children and giving them hope for the future. And that's what we want to do. When the rate of recidivism is down, crime is better off for every community, black, white, purple, brown, and everything. And so I have since being sworn into Congress on January 3rd, taken up criminal justice reform, prison reform, and civil rights issues as my mantle. And with Doug being gone, there is a gap to be filled. And I've passed 2 bills out of the House so far as a freshman, working with Democrats like Doug has. I've got a 3rd that will hopefully pass out of the House next week. But the 2nd bill I passed out of the House with Hakeem Jeffries, whom you worked with for a number of years, was to allow individuals in our prison system, their text conversations with their attorneys, their phone calls are protected by attorney-client privilege, but not their emails. Now, how they have access to me email, I don't know. But if they are going to email their attorneys, those communications ought to be protected. And it's very simple, and it's a small part that will make a big difference in somebody's life. And we just saw earlier this week, a few days ago, where Senator Tim Scott and Senator Cory Booker have been working for months now, maybe even longer than that, on a large criminal justice reform measure that is now going totally down the drain over the issue of qualified immunity. One thing, as usual, has broken up the entire reform package. So if there are ways that we can make a small difference, do something small and make a big difference in somebody's life, we've got to be able to do that. And I'm going to try to follow your lead and work on some of the same issues that you were doing and had not finished. I just became the subcommittee ranking Republican on a subcommittee for civil rights and civil liabilities under the Oversight Committee, and going to work really hard to try to fill some very big shoes now. We have a real opportunity, and this can be a winning issue for us across the board, across nationalities and races. We've got to do what's right for the American people, and this is one small way to do it.
You know, particularly as we talk about that constitutional aspect, you know, a lot of what we often think about is the prosecution side, right? You know, we think about making sure that anyone who's broken the law goes behind bars, but really there's a balance to that law. And particularly, you know, for the next question I want to ask is, actually we're fortunate to have former Trump appointee U.S. District Attorney Russell Coleman with us. And for those of you who don't know anything about him, for him not having held elected office, He's worked for the U.S. Senate for the Republicans. He was an FBI agent who served our country in Iraq with the FBI, and also then served as U.S. District Attorney. Basically, if James Bond had a law degree, it would be Russell Coleman. So I have to ask, you just recently testified in the U.S. Senate on the Equal Act, which is, I believe, going to get a vote just this coming week. Talk to us a little bit of, even in, again, the climate we are in today, what is the Equal Act? Because it's something that we're going to hear about in the news in the coming weeks. What is it, and why did you, as a federal prosecutor, go to testify on that bill?
And Micah, it is a privilege to be at this storied event, at this beautiful venue, and it's a privilege to be sitting here with these rock star leaders on my left and on my right. I'm a lot like the speaker at your high school graduation. Everyone remember him? Nope. And so it's a privilege to be up here. Why in the world, at a time when our nation is bleeding out in terms of violent crime, why in the world, when you have 327 homicides in Detroit last year, an all-time high, why in the world, when you have over 2,600 Michiganders die of drug overdose death, are we talking about criminal justice reform? There seems like there's a weariness to talk about criminal justice reform. We're talking about it because what we're doing is not working. Mm-hmm. We're talking about it because when I sat in Louisville, Kentucky in 2020, and you couldn't look through a window without seeing it boarded up. In Louisville, Kentucky in 2020, where the relationships between our black neighbors and law enforcement, the wheels came off. At a time when it was the highest homicide rate in the history of our city in Louisville in 2020. What we were doing wasn't working. And what I'm not saying is we should be, bless you, man, we should be anything other than aggressive in terms of serving as prosecutors. I'm not saying we back off of aggressive prosecution. But what I'm saying is we look at what we're doing. The numbers show us the empty seats at kitchen tables, the empty pews at churches show us that what we're doing in Michigan, in Kentucky, in Georgia, and South Carolina is not working. In any other area of policy, in education policy, and tax policy, and transportation, you're constantly improving, constantly evolving, constantly engaging in reform. It seems like in the criminal justice process, it's a box check. Once you do it, you move on to something else. Of all the areas of government policy, there is nothing more important than the public safety. We say public safety, than the safety of our families. So we should constantly be looking at the system, constantly tweaking it and improving it. And we use terms like recidivism and recidivate. We use that in these conversations. What that means, when you have recidivism, and that means reoffending. That means hurting people again. That means stealing from our parents and our grandparents. That means hurting police officers and hurting families. So we can use these terms, but recidivate means people get hurt. So if we can lower recidivism, if we can do a better job with those 95% congressmen that are coming home, we're going to save lives. We're going to protect police officers. We're going to protect our families. Right. So to your question, what is the Equal Act? The Equal Act is just as it says. It is equalizing in federal sentencing, and it becomes nuanced quickly, but it is saying that crack cocaine and powder cocaine should be sentenced at the same level in the federal system. What it's not is it's not taking powerful tools off the table for federal prosecutors. It is not removing mandatory minimums, big sticks, things that I used as a federal prosecutor that I would argue we need. Others in reform might take another position. I take the position you still need those. It's saying that in this climate, when the wheels have come off of relationships between law enforcement and our black neighbors and communities that are most predominantly impacted by violent crime, it is a limiting factor to relationships when those I engage with in communities impacted may not know the provision of federal law, but they know that crack cocaine, rock cocaine, and powder cocaine is treated differently in the federal system. And they know that it's chemically essentially the same thing. And they know that we've treated it at one point at 100 to 1, same substance 100 to 1. And back when crack was a challenge, back when crack wasn't the degree that a threat, that it's diminished that it is now, I understand a knee-jerk reaction by Congress to go hard. I understand that. But that's not the environment now. Crack is not the threat that it was in the late 1980s. You know what is? It's the wheels coming off between law enforcement and the people we serve. It's jury nullification. It's a lack of me being able to develop sources in some of these neighborhoods because there is a chasm, a wrenching apart between law enforcement and the communities that we serve. So the Equal Act is equalizing that. It's not taking away the powerful tools that we have, but it's saying we're going to treat it at a 1-to-1 ratio. And in this environment where everything is so dark and R's aren't talking to D's, Congresswoman will tell you she's a co-sponsor of this bill and a strong supporter of this bill. This is something where you have from your former colleague, Congressman Jeffries on the left, to my conservative colleague and friend on my left here.
Right, everyone.
Far right.
to Jim Jordan, to Louis Gohmert. I mean, this is a bill that has R's and D's from the most conservative. You come at this from all different perspectives. Not to give a nuanced term, but this bill's being voted on Monday in what's known as a suspension calendar in the U.S. House. That is a mechanism that when there is a non-controversial bill that will pass. So it's going to pass more than likely on Monday. We have something where R's and D's are coming together to try something different, still focused on public safety.
Oh, that's excellent.
Good thing.
Now, General Cameron, I think that there is, especially when you're a young Attorney General, that there's almost a fear of having an opportunity to distinguish yourself and then also welcoming the opportunity to distinguish yourself. And you've gotten to step into a massive role with a national issue when it comes to the recent opioid settlements. You know, and for those who are not familiar with what happened and what the settlement actually ended up in, and particularly what is going to now happen with those resources coming to communities, talk to us a little bit about what just came to bear.
Well, Micah, thank you, and thanks to everybody for paying attention to a really important issue around criminal justice reform and criminal justice issues. As a state attorney general, what has been important to our office is making sure that when it comes to interdiction efforts, meaning when our law enforcement community goes out, one, that they have the resources to be able to do that, but two, that they are able to focus on and prioritize those that are doing the most harm to our community. So in my judgment, and I think most of the law enforcement community in Kentucky, they want to go after the people that are pushing the poison and bringing this poison into all of our 120 counties, and I wholeheartedly agree with them on that mission, and we try to deploy resources out of our office to help with those interdiction efforts. So I constantly tell the men and women in law enforcement in Kentucky, you arrest the bad guys and we'll do our part to help effectively stemming the tide of addiction. From my judgment, I want to make sure, and I appreciate my distinguished panel here and the work that they're doing on the federal level. From my perspective, I want to make sure that folks aren't even getting into the system. And what I mean by that is breaking those cycles of addiction. Yep. So I talked about arresting the bad guys, but we have to also hold accountable those within our corporations, these big corporations that help peddle and push, whether it be through marketing or overzealous distribution into our communities. We need to make sure they're held accountable as well. And so I think of companies like McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health, and Pfizer that have been willing as of late to come to the table and say, we recognize that we've exacerbated some of the problems in your state. Look, we lost, based on the most recent data from the Kentucky Office of Drug Control Policy, 1,964 individuals to overdoses. That's untenable. These companies now recognize that they had a role in helping exacerbate that. So they've come to the table in what's called a global settlement with those companies. So myself, other attorneys general across the country have said we need help in repairing our communities and restoring hope in our communities. So in Kentucky in particular, because of this global settlement that we recently signed on to, we stand to bring in excess of $480 million. And that $480 million is significant because when it comes into our state, when it comes into the Commonwealth, we are going to be in a position to help with what's generally referred to as abatement. Abatement means education, training, housing, transportation, all those things that are necessary and appropriate when, again, we're trying to break the tide or trying to break the cycles of addiction and stem that tide and the affliction that has plagued our people for far too long. So I'm excited about this down payment in many ways that's going to ensure that kids grow up in homes that are not been overtaken by trauma because of the drug epidemic. I'm excited because those parents are going to be able to get the help that they need, make sure that they're in a position not only to help themselves but also provide for their families and keep down that recidivism rate that Representative Collins just spoke about. It is so important that we do everything possible, whether it be on the federal level or on the state level, to keep our families together and to restore that hope that we all so desperately need as we move forward in this decade.
No, absolutely. Now, something that comes to mind is that back in 2017, the Department of Justice under President Trump released a study that showed that 44% of those that are in the prison system have been diagnosed with some form of mental health issue. And I know that for you, Congresswoman, you recently had something right in Charleston County that was really quite startling. Tell us a little bit about the story, about what happened and how mental health factored into it.
Yeah, that would be the story of Jamal Sutherland. So I represent South Carolina's 1st Congressional District. It's Charleston, South Carolina, down to Hilton Head and Beaufort. Everyone thinks of South Carolina as being big, bright, and red. Well, I actually represent a very purple, maybe even blue district, and we won by 1 point in November. The district that I represent is the home of Mother Emanuel, where 9 black church members were murdered by white supremacists 6 years ago. 10 feet from my district, in Jim Clyburn's district, was the death of Walter Scott, where a policeman shot him in the back when he was pulled over for not paying child support and placed a taser beside him after he shot him to death. And then 9 months ago, there was a story of Jamal Sutherland that got national attention. Jamal, who is a constituent of mine, as are his parents, who both served in our military, and 2 of their children also are serving in the military today, active duty, have served their country with such honor. But they had a 31-year-old son who lived at home, who had a bipolar, schizophrenic kind of disorder, mental health disorder, and would on occasion check himself into a mental health institution when he was having problems. Never been arrested in his life. Might even been on the autism spectrum. He was very bright and gifted in that regard as well. And he was having some trouble in December and checked himself into a mental health hospital, and there was an altercation there that we find out he was trying to break up this fight instead of start it, and he was somehow arrested and put in a county jail. And a few hours later, he wasn't, we understand, read his Miranda rights. His parents were not called. And when they went to take him and extract him for his bond hearing, and this is in the middle of COVID, they were taking him out of his jail cell where he was alone to take him to a room with Wi-Fi to go to a bond hearing that had no requirement to be to. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that you have to attend your bond hearing. A judge can issue bond with or without you present. And he didn't make it out of his jail cell alive. He was tased to death by 2 of I'm going to say cops, but law enforcement officials, non-deputized law enforcement officials in that jail. And heartbreaking, to say the least. Charleston is a little bit different. We don't have riots. We don't have violence. We actually, our communities, black and white, Republican and Democrat, we generally come together when these tragedies hit our communities. And our communities have a long history of this kind of violence happening. And it was heartbreaking. And as I mentioned earlier, as a state lawmaker, I took up prison reform and criminal justice reform as a state lawmaker inspired by the First Step Act, Doug Collins and President Trump, their leadership there. And so this has been kind of a mantle issue for me. And this happened on January 5th, I believe. And so I've been exploring ways to address the mental health crisis. At the federal level, I've been very difficult to get any kind of information on how many people are in prison with mental health issues. We see it in the streets where our police are so overwhelmed. They were not trained to deal with the mental health crisis in our country today. When I talk to my cops and my state troopers, 5 years ago, they might see 1 every few days mental health cases. Today, they're seeing it multiple times, 5, 6, 12 times in a day. We're just not equipped for this. They were not equipped for this. And so I'm exploring and working on the mental health. How do we handle mental health at the federal level with the prison system? What type of legislation can we do to make these reforms better? How do we provide the resources needed to these individuals when they're both in prison and then when they get out? One of the programs that I've been fascinated by in South Carolina, in Charleston actually, is a program that takes violent offenders, and oftentimes there's a mental health issue, but they put them in intensive therapy, intensive group therapy, job training, and the rate of recidivism, the rate of them going back to jail or prison is about 22%. The national rate is what, 65, 66%. The issues that we have today, why our prisons are so full, they're often filled with people that more or less have mental health issues that should be taken care of in a different setting. And these are places where Republicans can win. These are issues that we can win on all across the nation, because it's not just Charleston. We're seeing this all over the country. And so I've been inspired by Jamal's death and want to do that work. And I'm working with his family. I'm working with the attorneys that are representing the family to find ways to do that. When he was killed, murdered in the jail, the left, the Democrats, protected the sheriff. She was a newly elected sheriff because she's a Democrat. She got protected. The one person who was speaking out about the travesties and what was done legally and illegally and against policy in this case was a Republican. And if we fight on these issues and we make a difference, we'll make a difference in all of these communities across the country, and it's an important issue for us to champion and be a part of. So I am here for it.
Well, for Mr. Coleman, I mean, you've had such, with your diverse career, you've had that unique perspective. And one of the things that is often a concern for conservatives who believe in the rule of law, the concern is that if we are approaching criminal justice reform issues, that we cannot do it at the same time as supporting our law enforcement. With your background in law enforcement, and particularly then as a prosecutor, what are the principles that for you, maybe even more so as a conservative, come into play when you are thinking about reform issues?
Well, first and foremost is public safety. This conversation should start and stop with how does it impact public safety? We throw around terms like criminal justice reform, but that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. It's like the Potter Stewart standard of obscenity. You kind of know it when you see it. So ask the question of what we're talking about. Sometimes there's reflexively a sense that criminal justice reform is coming at it from the left. Well, you've heard from as strong conservatives as exist here how criminal justice reform is the right constitutional, public safety-driven thing to do in the right context. But you got to ask the question of how does it impact public safety? But secondly, listen. Before I testified on behalf of the Equal Act before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee, I did a lot more listening to prosecutors and deputies and drug task forces and federal judges as to their view before I presumed to go out and share mine, before I came to a realization. And their consensus was, it's not a threat and it's a great opportunity for us to build bridges. So talk to the people that do this for a living, and I think you'll find it's reflexively not no. The prosecutors and deputies, the people inside of jails and prisons who deal with offenders day in and day out, know that what we're doing is not working. Know that we have to lean in more on mental health, that we are broken in terms of mental health. Know that our recidivism rate, again, the rate of reoffending and hurting people, is far too high. So why wouldn't we constantly try to approach the system and tweak the system so that we can have a better impact on public safety, protect our families more effectively? We are sky high nationally in terms of overdose deaths. Front page of the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal is reporting on overdose deaths. We are sky high. We are bleeding out in cities from Detroit to Flint to Louisville in terms of violent crime. But what we're doing is not working.
General Cameron, would you add a thought to that?
Well, I would just say that, when you look at what we've done here recently in Kentucky as it relates to increasing the felony threshold, one of the reasons, and Russell sort of made mention of this, one of the reasons we did that in Kentucky is because it was, I think, seen globally by law enforcement, where you look at our prosecutors or our state troopers or police, that it allows for them, if they're not having to look at things that are up to $1,000 with the same felony lens, it allows them to reprioritize and go after those bad guys that I talked about earlier. I think that's important because if someone gets in the system at the level of $500 for a felony, then they're likely to stay in that system. And so from our perspective, and I think those that are on this panel as well, and I know the state legislature, we wanted to ensure that there was less opportunity to get in the system, less opportunity to recidivate. And so that is my perspective, and I think Russell summed that up well as well.
No, absolutely. Now, Congressman, I think that we would be remiss to step away from this conversation without acknowledging some of the great work that the Michigan legislature has done over the last several years when we talk about criminal justice. I mean, everything from working on parole, objective parole, getting that done. I know also with work that they have done on expungement is also significant to your point about people getting back in. Being able to take that off the record is influential when we talk about employment and housing, et cetera. And that is phenomenal work from your leadership right here in Michigan. But I think that for all of us that we can agree that just because we've done great things doesn't mean that we're done. We're not on victory laps just yet. And I think that in particular, there are Republican leaders right now in the Michigan legislature that are looking to take up important state reforms that have even gotten a bad rap in some other states when they were done poorly. When we talk about pretrial reforms, as Republicans, we're pretty darn good about talking about the First and Second Amendments, and sometimes we trail off a little bit after those. If we're talking about the Sixth and Eighth Amendment in particular, we're talking about speedy trials, and we're talking about excessive bail shall not be set. For you as a practicing attorney, a champion for constitutional rights at the federal level and your work before that in the state, what are the principles that Michiganders should be looking at right now as this important issue is taken up?
Well, and you're right. One of the things as conservatives, we can't just stop on amendments we like. Okay, there's the whole amendment. And for anybody in here who doesn't believe the speedy trial applies to them or the searching process here, the parole process, if they don't believe that, then you're fooling yourself. And I think what we've got to understand is it's going to take leadership, and the leadership that's been shown in Michigan has been great. But take it the next step, take it the next level, and look at things that work. Just because, and it's sort of in a very conservative environment here, I just want to say this: just because liberals have done it badly in other places, do not mean that conservatives can't come in and do it right. Okay? And I've been working across the country, and I'm so proud of this panel here, and Congressman Mace and Coleman and the general here have just laid this out. But we've got to be the ones taking it. Do not take a back seat, Michigan. Do not take Michigan GOP, and do not take a back seat to anybody on the left who says these are their issues. No, these are issues that conservatives have been a part forever. These are the part about lifting other people up, taking them and giving them an opportunity. And if it's about speedy trial, if it's about pretrial, if it's about bail, if it's these kind of things, those are not easy. But I don't know about you, but especially if you're an elected official in this room, and if you're those who support those elected officials, you did not get elected to find the easy button. You got elected to solve problems, and conservatives are the ones who solve problems. And speaking about mental health, let me just tell you this, 'cause I've heard this from, and you probably heard this from law, well, that's expensive. If we put money into, rehab and all this kind of, what are we going to put money in roads? Let me ask you this. If you don't put money into mental health, I'm going to tell you where you're going to put it. You're going to put it in your corrections budget. You're going to put it in your law enforcement budget, because you are going to pay for it one way or the other. So my answer is take the opportunity. Be leaders. I'm a member of the conservative GOP. I'm a member of one, and I came up here, and my wife and I, to see you and just encourage you, say, go do big things, because that's who we are.
Well, folks, want to again thank you so much. As a kid who lived in Coldwater for a while as a kid, I got to say, I always do love coming back to Michigan. Thank you so much for our wonderful hosts. Thank you for the Christian Coalition for helping put this panel together. And thank you to all of our panelists for coming from all over the country for this important conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our hosts.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next panel will begin in 5 minutes.